All right, good morning. Welcome to the Title I Part A Campus Selection Schedule SC5000 and within LEA allocation statewide virtual training. My name is Jaime Huerta and I am the Senior Division Director in the Federal Program Compliance Division and the Title I Part A State Director. My colleague Vivian Smurl will also be presenting today. So this presentation is intended solely to provide general information and guidance to Texas LEAs, ESCs, nonprofit subgrantees, and participating private schools receiving equitable services. The content of this presentation reflects the Texas Education Agency's current understanding of statute and applicable federal guidance. The content of today's presentation is subject to change as a result of future guidance and/or updates received by federal agencies with regulatory oversight of our programs. The presentation does not constitute legal advice, and entities are therefore advised to seek legal counsel regarding the information and guidance provided in today's presentation before acting upon the information provided. An additional reminder, we have an artificial intelligence disclaimer. The TEA does not permit third-party recording or the use of artificial intelligence summary services during our grant-related trainings. Attendees of our grant-related trainings may not use AI services, language models, applications, interfaces, or assistance to attend, review, or record the trainings. TEA further prohibits any person or entity from using the information included in its grant-related trainings to train AI technologies. Any attendees of TEA's grant-related trainings who violate this prohibition may be removed from the trainings and may be barred from attending future grant-related trainings. We are recording today's training, and it will be posted on our Federal Program Compliance Division Title I Part A webpage when the recordings are available. Additionally, to ensure that there is enough time to cover the content provided in the training, we will be providing written responses to the questions that are posed in the Q&A. If we can have you please post all your questions in the Q&A, we will try to answer as we are going through the training in writing in the Q&A window. But if we don't get to your question, we will be posting all the questions with their respective responses within a week after the training, where we are also posting the video. So please let us know you are attending this training or listening to this training by completing the presentation check-in form. You can click on the attendance survey link that Vivian has included in the chat. And you can also use the QR code to let us know that you are here. Additionally, we have included a link to the presentation slides in the chat as well. As I mentioned, I already introduced myself, but I'll let my colleague introduce herself. We'll be kind of co-presenting today's training.
Good morning. I'm Vivian Smurl. I work with Title I Part A in the Federal Program Compliance Division at TEA. We're glad you're here today.
Please feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions that you may have either during the training or after the training. Our contact information is on the screen, and we are always ready and available to serve you. So for today's training, we hope that you are going to gain a better understanding of the steps used to determine Title I Part A campus eligibility in completing the SC5000, the Title I Part A campus selection schedule in the ESSA Consolidated Application. We also hope that you're going to get a better understanding of the factors determining the amount to be allocated to Title I campuses and the different steps used to determine Title I Part A allocations to campuses. The Title I Part A requirements that are going to be referenced in the presentation are based on the most current reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which is currently the Every Student Succeeds Act. The intent and purpose of the Title I Part A program is to provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education and to close the educational achievement gaps. So Everything that we'll be covering today is based on the Title I Part A statute and the statutory requirements for determining Title I Part A campus eligibility and allocating funds to those Title I Part A eligible campuses. Throughout the presentation, we will be making references to the acronym LEA, which stands for Local Educational Agency. That's how it is referred to in statute. And when I'm referring to LEAs, we are including school districts or traditional school districts or consolidated school districts, as well as charter school systems. So the LEA acronym is all inclusive of the different school systems in the state of Texas. So we will begin the portion of the training by reviewing the instructions for completing the SC5000, which is a Title I Part A campus selection schedule, based on the Title I campus eligibility requirements that'll be referenced. And we'll go through all those instructions as we continue through the morning. So the SC5000, Title I Part A campus selection schedule is required if an LEA is applying for Title I Part A funds, and such funds are budgeted in the budget schedules of the ESSA Consolidated Application. In this schedule, the LEA is providing information for each campus as it relates to whether the campus will be a Title I Part A campus. The SC5000 can be accessed in the eGrant system from the table of contents of the ESSA Consolidated Federal Grant Application, as shown on the screenshot on the slide. So we will begin by reviewing some of the SC5000 functionality options. At the top right-hand corner of the schedule, there is a button labeled Instructions. Clicking on the button will download a PDF version of detailed instructions to complete the SC5000. For your reference, I have included a link to those instructions for our updated instructions for this year's SC5000 schedule. On the screen, you can see a screenshot of the first 2 pages. I believe it's a 10-page document, so it takes you through each of the steps for completing the SC5000. Additionally, at the top of the schedule, you can also locate and click on the View/Print Report feature. This is really important if you're the one that's responsible for completing this schedule. Now, this report will be helpful once you've entered all the information. When you click on the View Print Report feature, a report will be generated that includes the information that you have entered into the SC5000. Again, this report is helpful once all the data have been entered to review the information. The report is available to assist with ensuring compliance with the rank and serve statutory requirements that we'll cover later on during the presentation. The report automatically sorts the campuses with the highest low-income percentage to the lowest low-income percentages and allows you to kind of review and ensure that you've served or you have a campus status for Title I served campuses in the appropriate order and that you haven't inadvertently not served a campus out of order. So again, this report is available and can be very beneficial to assist you in ensuring that you have entered the correct information for each of the campuses. Now, on the bottom of the screen is a back button. To navigate the back button, if you click on the back button, it'll take you back to the table of contents. Additionally, there is a printable version button. The printable version button, will print out what appears on the screen of the SC5000. This is different from the View Print Report that I previously went over. And then, of course, there's a Save button, and it'll allow you to save the report as you enter information on the report. Additionally, there is a drop-down menu at the bottom right-hand corner that allows you to navigate through the different schedules that are applicable to the LEA. So you simply click on that drop-down button, and it'll allow you to navigate through the different schedules within the ESSA Consolidated Application. So now that we've completed going over the functionality options of the SC5000, I'll now have you take a first look at the general information which is found in the schedule header. So in the schedule header, the LEA information is pre-populated with no input required by the LEA. Section A of the SC5000 includes LEA-specific data. Let's take a look at that specific data. The header row includes the LEA county district number and LEA name that is pre-populated with no input required. The LEA name that is pre-populated in row 1 is pre-populated, and for row 2, the LEA total low income percentage by calculating the total number of students in the LEA who may meet the LEA selected poverty measure. That's where you will type in that percentage. So let's take a look at the calculation for that low income percentage. So for calculating that low income percentage, you are to take the total number of students who meet the LEA selected poverty measure and divide that by the LEA's total number of students. And we will go over the various options for poverty measures later on during the presentation. But again, this row 2 requires a percentage to be entered into that field. So we're now going to take a look at the requirements for determining poverty counts to be reported on the SC5000 for the LEA and for campuses. The requirements that will follow related to poverty measures can be found in section 1113 of the ESSA statute. It is important to note that an LEA with an enrollment of fewer than 1,000 students is exempt in statute from having to use the poverty measures to determine which of its schools receive Title I funds. Such an LEA may use other criteria such as academic performance or the grade span of its schools to determine which of its schools receive Title I funds, or it may choose to allocate Title I funds to all of its schools. Similarly, if an LEA consists of only one school, the LEA does not have to follow the requirements of section 1113 that pertain to determining which of its schools receive Title I funds and the amounts of their allocations, because its only school will receive the amount the LEA has available to allocate to public schools. So again, this is important, especially if you are working in an LEA that has less than 1,000 students or that you only operate one school. The following requirements do not apply for determining eligibility of Title I campuses. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be taking a look at how you determine those low income percentages to determine whether campuses are eligible to receive Title I funds. So to determine the number of public school students from low income families, the ESSA statute provides an LEA the option to use a number of options, right? But all the options include using the number of public school children that are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, the number of students receiving temporary assistance for needy families, the number of students eligible to receive Medicaid or medical assistance under the Medicaid program, and students ages 5 to 17 in poverty as counted in the most recent LEA level census poverty data approved by the U.S. Department of Education. Now note, because census data are generally not available at the school level, if an LEA uses this measures, it would most likely be part of a composite with one or more of the above measures, or one or more of the 3 other measures. The LEA can also has a flexibility to use a composite of any of the above measures. Now, in determining poverty counts, an LEA must use the same measure of poverty to identify eligible school attendance areas and schools, rank areas and schools, and to determine the allocation for each area, and school. So again, it should be the same measure of poverty. So if you're using free and reduced price lunch data for the LEA poverty percentage, it should also be used to identify those eligible school attendance areas, to rank the schools, and to determine the allocation for each area and school. Now, for the year of data to be used to determine poverty counts, an LEA must use the most recently available data, which will be from the previous school year in most cases. Okay, let's go back one, sorry. So for example, with respect to Title I school allocations for the coming school year for 25-26, an LEA that uses free and reduced price lunch data will generally use the data that was collected during the 24-25 school year. And again, most LEAs use the data obtained from the most recent October snapshot date. And again, because the most recent October snapshot date is the most recently available data, that is acceptable to use in determining poverty counts. So now that we've looked at determining the poverty measure to be used to allocate funds to Title I eligible campuses, I wanted to make a quick reference to also Section 1112 of the ESSA statute that includes some requirements related to LEA plans. Each LEA is required to develop a Title I Part A LEA program plan. That is a statutory requirement. And the requirements can be included in the LEA's district improvement plan, which is the state plan that's required for all LEAs. And it could be included in either in various parts of the plan or as an addendum to the district improvement plan. The LEA Title I program plan includes the following requirements: timely and meaningful consultation of stakeholders, coordination, activities that address student academic achievement as it relates to meeting the state challenging academic standards, periodic review and revisions, and there are 13 required statutory descriptions. For purposes of today's training, we're not going to go through all the requirements, but there is one that is applicable to what we're meeting about today. And that's one of the descriptions that's required related to the process the LEA will use to determine their poverty counts. So in statute, it is required that the LEA include in their LEA Title I program plan or district improvement plan that they include and describe the poverty criteria that will be used to select school attendance areas under Section 1113. An LEA will want to be sure to include such a description in their plan. So again, based on the poverty measures that I previously shared, you're going to want to note in your plan which of those poverty measures you are using to identify low-income students and to be able to calculate the poverty percentages. So now that we have reviewed the measures of poverty for calculating the low-income percentages for the LEA and campuses, we're going to return to completing the SC5000. So again, we reviewed those poverty measures so that you could determine what you were going to be putting in row 2 of Section A of the SC5000 schedule. Now we're moving on to row 3. Row 3 of Section A is the LEA's total enrollment, which is pre-populated with no input required. This number will be automatically calculated based on the sum of campus enrollment numbers entered by the LEA in Part B for each of the campuses. So again, it's just going to calculate a total of all the enrollment numbers that were entered for each of the campuses. Section B of the SC5000 is the section where the LEA will enter the campus-specific data for all campuses. In the top right-hand corner above Section B is the Copy Prior Year Data feature button. Selecting this button populates the SC5000 with data from the latest valid submission of your LEA's prior year ESSA Consolidated Federal Grant Application. Only the following data will be populated: basis of eligibility, campus status, and consolidated funds. Now, although the copy prior year data option is a functionality of the application, it is important for the individual that is completing the schedule to verify eligibility to ensure that the campuses still meet the eligibility requirements specifically for the campus status that was copied from the prior year. Additionally, the other columns are not able to be copied from prior year data because such data changes from year to year. For example, the campus enrollment and campus low income percentage should be updated annually to reflect the most current numbers. So it is important that if you are new in this position, that you don't get all the information that was submitted in last year's SC5000 and just automatically manually copy it into this year's, because there are things that need to be updated on an annual basis. Additionally, we have some words of caution about the following when using the copy prior year data. So keep in mind that copying prior year data will overwrite any data that you have manually entered in Section B. If you choose to copy prior year data, select the button before you manually enter any data. So again, if you want to use the copy prior year button feature, click on it first and then begin entering the data. Prior year data may only be copied into Section B on the original submission of the application. So moving on, as we review in detail the columns in Section B, we would also like to share a suggested order for completing Section B. This is the order that we will be following to provide the instructions and information related to this section of the training. So let's take a look at the different order of completing Section B. So you should start by entering the total campus enrollment, then the campus low income percentage, followed by the basis of eligibility, if applicable, additional Title I eligibility, then the campus status, then if applicable, additional school-wide eligibility, the number of students served on a targeted assistance campus. That's only, again, if applicable. If you select targeted assistance for a campus status, then that column will be required. Consolidated funds column, if applicable, and then the other column would be the last thing that you would enter if applicable. And we're going to be going through each of these columns throughout the rest of this training. So the 3-digit campus number, name, and grade span of the LEA's campuses will be pre-populated from information in Ask TED. Ask TED is a Texas education directory that is maintained by the agency. Ask TED is usually updated in late May. Districts traditional school districts are responsible for maintaining accurate campus information in Ask TED, and charter schools must contact the charter school administration division to make any changes to Ask TED. So again, that'll be pre-populated from Ask TED, so there is no input required for the campuses. They'll automatically be populated on the schedule. Now, in the total campus enrollment column, that's where you're going to type the campus enrollment. And it's the actual enrollment on the campus, and the enrollment data entered should correspond with the low income percentage year of data to be entered. For example, if the LEA is using National School Lunch Program data from the previous year's snapshot data, the enrollment data entered should be from the previous year's snapshot data as well. The LEA should maintain documentation locally that justifies the total campus enrollment that was reported on the SC5000. Now, please note that an enrollment of 0 is acceptable only under the following situations. The campus is closed, the campus is new and will not be served, the campus is an alternative campus, and by alternative campus, it means that the students are temporarily attending classes at the alternative campus, and permanent records and primary services are provided and kept at the student's home campus, and additionally, student accountability is tied to the home campus where the student is enrolled. Now, if an alternative campus reports student enrollment data in the Public Education Information Management System, known as PEIMS, then it must report enrollment for the campus on the SC5000. Additionally, if a campus is closed, Ask TED usually keeps that information in its system for a couple of years, so that campus may continue to show up on the SC5000 schedule. Again, it is okay to put a 0 for campus enrollment because that campus is closed. Now let's take a look at the campus low income percent column. This is required to be entered for each of the campuses. To calculate the campus low income percentage, you will divide the number of low income students by the figure entered on the total campus enrollment field and enter that result in this column. We will be going over the basis of eligibility column next, but if you select residing in the basis of eligibility column, you will calculate the campus low income percentage using the residing numbers. If you select enrollment in the basis of eligibility column, then you will calculate the campus low income percentage using the enrollment number. Now, for each campus, you will then select the basis of eligibility from the drop-down list to reflect how the eligibility determination was made. So again, this is the third column to complete. We went through campus enrollment first, campus low income number. Now we're selecting basis of eligibility. Now, the basis of eligibility options for each campus on the SC5000 includes none, residing, which is the number of students residing in the attendance area, enrollment, which is the number of students enrolled on the campus. Now, if this basis is selected, the date used to determine the enrollment number must be the same for all campuses. Now, we also have feeder pattern as an option for basis of eligibility, optional method, and direct certification. Now, we will now go over in brief detail what each of these options mean. So a basis of eligibility of none is acceptable only under the following situations. The campus has 0 enrollment, the campus is closed, the campus is new and will not be served, the campus is an alternative campus, and again, by alternative campus, it means that students are temporarily attending classes at the alternative campus and permanent records and primary services are provided and kept at the student's home campus. Additionally, student accountability is tied to the home campus where the student is enrolled. Now, before we take a look at the process, so the next part of the presentation is going to be taking a look at the process for ranking and identifying eligible campuses. And I wanted to clarify eligibility requirements as it relates to overall Title I eligibility and campus-based program eligibility. So in order for a campus to operate a campus-based program, they must meet overall Title I eligibility requirements. So on the following slides, we're going to be discussing the criteria for overall Title I eligibility. Once you have determined that a campus is eligible to operate a Title I program, then it can be decided whether the campus is eligible to operate a school-wide program or if they will be operating a targeted assistance program. But again, it's really important to first identify or determine whether a campus is eligible to operate a Title I campus-based program. So now we will cover school-wide eligibility criteria later in the presentation. So ESSA statute requires an LEA with at least 1,000 students enrolled to rank all of its campuses based on their low income percentage. ESSA statute also permits an LEA to rank its schools according to the percentage of public school students from low income students that are enrolled in the schools or that reside in the attendance areas. So we will now take a look at 4 steps for ranking and identifying eligible campuses. So the 4 steps include ranking campuses in order of poverty without regard to the grade span they serve, identifying eligible campuses as per the 75% rule. There is also an option for high schools with a poverty rate between 50% and 75%. And then we'll go over all the options for serving remaining campuses. But again, you must identify eligibility and serve campuses based on A, B, C, and D as listed here. So the LEA will begin the process of ranking and identifying eligible campuses by ranking campuses in order of poverty without regard to the grade span they serve. In this example, the LEA included the schools listed by letter of the alphabet, the grade served, the enrollment number, the number of eligible for free and reduced price lunch, which in this example, that's the poverty measure that was selected by the LEA, and then the poverty percentage. Now notice that the campuses are ranked from having the highest poverty percentage to having the lowest poverty percentage. So again, this is a first step in the process of you ranking the campuses in order without regard to the grade span that they serve. And just a quick reminder, once you've entered the enrollment data and low income data for your campuses, you can use the view print report option that automatically will rank the campuses for you based on campus low income percentage. So after an LEA has ranked all of its schools by percentage of poverty, the ESSA statute requires the LEA to first allocate in rank order of poverty Title I funds to its schools above 75%, including any middle schools or high schools. Thus, before an LEA can decide how to determine eligibility for any school with a poverty percentage that does not exceed 75%, it must allocate Title I funds to all its schools above 75% poverty. So in this example, the LEA would identify the campus or campuses above 75% poverty. And since public school A is the only campus above 75% poverty, it is the first campus that is required to be allocated Title I Part A funds. Now, if a campus meets Title I eligibility based on having a low income percentage above 75%, the basis of eligibility to be noted on the SC5000 would either be residing or enrollment based on the data the LEA used to calculate the low income percentage reported for the campus on the SC5000. So after an LEA has ranked all of its schools by poverty percentage and identified schools with a poverty percent above 75%, if there are funds remaining, an LEA may choose to serve high schools with a poverty percentage between 50 and 75% in rank order of poverty. Now, the implementation of this option occurs before serving any other grade span. Now, this is not required. This is a flexibility that is noted in the statute as an option rather than a requirement. So again, an LEA can decide whether they're going to exercise this option or flexibility, or they can then move on to the next step. Now, if an LEA does decide that they want to use that certain option for high schools, again, the acceptable selections for basis of eligibility would be either residing or enrollment for those campuses noted on the SC5000 schedule. So we're getting down to the bottom, the last set of options for serving the remaining campuses. So again, after an LEA has ranked all its schools by percentage, identified schools with a poverty percent above 75, and determined if they're going to be serving high schools above 50% poverty, if funds remain, the LEA now has additional options for serving the remaining campuses. And we're going to go over those in detail. So the options that are available to continue serving campuses is are the LEA poverty percentage option, the 35% or greater poverty option, the feeder pattern, optional method, or direct certification. And again, we're going to go in detail through all of these options. Now, the first options we will take a look at are the LEA average and the above 35% poverty options. A school is eligible for Title I funds if its poverty percentage is as high as the LEA's poverty percentage, or at the LEA's discretion, at least 35%. So for example, if an LEA's poverty percentage is 30%, any school in the LEA that has a poverty percentage of at least 30% is Title I Part A eligible. In contrast, for an LEA with a poverty percentage of 35% or greater, the schools that are eligible for Title I are those with a poverty percentage that equals or exceeds the LEA's poverty percentage, unless the LEA chooses to make eligible all schools with a poverty percentage of 35% or more. As will be discussed later during the allocations portion of this training, meeting the Title I eligibility criteria does not guarantee that a school will receive Title I funds from its LEA, because receipt of those funds depends on the amount of an LEA's allocation and school poverty rankings and the per pupil amount that is allocated to each school. So let's take a look at an example for an LEA with a poverty percentage that is less than 35%. If an LEA's poverty percentage is 20%, any school in the LEA that has a poverty percentage of at least 20% is eligible to receive Title I funds to operate a campus-based program. Now let's take a look at an example for an LEA with a poverty percentage of 35% or greater. If an LEA has a poverty percentage of 55%, the campuses that are eligible for Title I are those with a poverty percentage that equals or exceeds the 55%, unless the LEA chooses to make eligible all schools with a poverty percentage of 35% or more. In this case, since the LEA's percentage is 35% or greater, they can serve campuses all the way down to 35% if they choose to do so. Now, as we will discuss later when we take a look at allocating funds to eligible schools, meeting the eligibility criteria does not guarantee that a school will receive the Title I funds from its LEA, as I previously mentioned. So let's take a look at an example where the LEA will be using the LEA's poverty percentage, which is below 35%, to determine Title I eligibility for its campuses. So based on a previous example, we had already determined that School A met the eligibility criteria since it was above 75%. Remember that campuses with a poverty percentage above 75% are automatically Title I eligible and are the first that are required to be allocated funds. Now, based on the data in this table, the LEA's poverty percentage is 34%. Thus, schools G, C, D, O, B, F, I, E, and H are eligible because their poverty percentage is as high as the LEA's poverty percentage. Now let's take a look at an example where the LEA's poverty percentage is 35% or greater. Now, based on a previous example, we had already determined that the School A met the eligibility criteria since it's above 75%. And based on the table, the LEA's poverty percentage is 36.2. So schools G, C, D, O, B, F, and Q are eligible because their poverty percentage is greater than or equal to the LEA poverty percentage of 36.2. Now, since an LEA can make campuses Title I-A eligible down to at least 35%, if they choose to do so, in this example, the LEA can make campuses I and E eligible since the poverty percentage for each campus is at least 35%. So if a campus meets Title I eligibility based on one or two of the options we just went over, the basis of eligibility that is acceptable to be noted as either residing or enrollment, again, based on the data that was provided for campus enrollment or campus low income percentage. So now we're going to take a look at an example of the SC5000 for a campus that has a low income percentage that is 35% or greater and less than the LEA's low income percentage. So on this SC5000, Edgar ISD reported that their low income percentage is 39.54%. Now for Edgar Elementary, they reported a low income percentage of 36.24%. Although the campus low income percentage is less than the LEA's low income percentage, they are still eligible to receive Title I funds because the campus low income percentage is 35% or greater. Now let's take a look at an example of the SC5000 for a campus that has a low income percentage that is less than 35%, but greater than the LEA's low income percentage. So on this SC5000, ESSA ISD reported that their low income percentage for the district is 32.54%. For ESSA Junior High School, they reported a low income percentage of 33.24%. Although the campus low income percentage is less than 35%, they are still eligible to receive a Title I campus allocation because the campus low income percentage is equal to or greater than the LEA's low income percentage of 32.54%. Now let's take a look at the feeder pattern option. This option can be used to establish a middle or high school campus's Title I Part A or school-wide eligibility by projection based on the number of low-income students in the elementary school attendance areas that feed into that particular middle school or high school campus. The LEA must maintain the following documentation for any campus whose eligibility is established via feeder pattern: low income numbers and enrollment from those campuses that comprise the feeder pattern for the campus in question. Now, before an LEA may use feeder patterns to determine the poverty percentage of secondary schools, the LEA must conduct outreach to its secondary schools to inform them of the option, and a majority of its secondary schools must approve the use of feeder patterns. A secondary school would be defined as a middle school and high school. Please note that if there are multiple schools feeding into a campus, the LEA would need to take into consideration the number of low-income students for all the campuses feeding into the campus in question when determining the feeder pattern low-income percentage. So now let's take a look at an SC5000 tip for a campus using the feeder pattern option to establish Title I eligibility. If a campus meets Title I eligibility based on the option referenced here, which is feeder pattern, and it is to be a Title I served campus, the basis of eligibility noted on the SC5000 would be feeder pattern. The LEA would report the projected low income percentage for the campus based on the feeder pattern. The LEA would maintain locally for documentation purposes the list of feeder campuses, low income numbers, and enrollment from those campuses that comprise the feeder pattern for the campus in question. So again, in campus low income percentage, you would include the feeder pattern low income percentage and not the actual campus's low income percentage. And we're going to take a look at some examples. So on this SC5000, MOE ISD is trying to establish Title I eligibility for MOE middle school. MOE has a low income of 34.24, MOE middle school, And the LEA has a low income percentage of 46.23%. Since MOE middle school's low income percentage is not equal to or greater than 35% and not equal to or greater than the LEA low income percentage, the campus is not Title I eligible using the LEA poverty percent of 35% options or 35% options. So the LEA is now going to try using the feeder pattern option to establish Title I eligibility for MOE middle school by projection. Now, since MOE Elementary is the only campus that feeds into MOE middle school, the LEA can use the feeder campus's low income percentage to establish eligibility for MOE middle school. If the LEA chooses to use feeder pattern to establish Title I eligibility for MOE middle school, they would need to include the campus low income percentage for the feeder pattern that makes the campus Title I eligible, and they would need to select feeder pattern as a basis of eligibility for the campus in question. So they would note 43.25% for MOE middle school, which is the feeder pattern percentage, and they would select feeder pattern for basis of eligibility. Again, going back to this slide, again, it is really important for this example. It was an easy way of calculating the feeder pattern low income percentage because in this example, there's just one elementary that feeds into the middle school. However, if an LEA has multiple elementary schools that would be feeding into that middle school, you would have to take the feeder, you would have to calculate the low income percentage for all the elementary schools that feed into that middle school and include that campus low income percentage. And again, the feeder pattern low income percentage would have to meet Title I eligibility requirements in order for feeder pattern to be an option for that campus. So the next option that we're going over is called the optional method. This is another way in which a campus may establish Title I eligibility. So this is for a campus that is unable to establish Title I eligibility using the number of students residing in its attendance area. The optional method may be selected if the percentage of enrolled low-income students is equal to or greater than the low-income percentage of a participating campus. So again, this one is using residing numbers rather than enrollment. And again, we do not see this very often. But it is a method that's available or an option that is available to LEAs. If the campus meets Title I eligibility based on the option reference here and is to be Title I served, then the basis of eligibility noted on the SC5000 would be optional method. And now the final option that's available for determining Title I eligibility is the direct certification option. Now, this option may be used if an LEA is using the community eligibility provision or Department of Agriculture reported numbers and percentages, and identified students are eligible through the Richard B. Russell National School Lunch Act. Now, keep in mind that this option is selected only when the LEA is solely using direct certification data as a poverty measure. Keep in mind that the number of students directly certified is a subset of the total number of students eligible for free and reduced price meals. So again, if you have a community eligibility provision program within your LEA, and you are not using any other free and reduced price lunch data, and you're just using the direct certification list that your food service director receives. Usually it's a food service director that receives this highly confidential data. If you are just using that direct certification data, then you would select direct certification as a basis of eligibility. However, if you're using other options, for example, you're using a survey that replicates the free and reduced price lunch data to determine your poverty counts for community eligibility provision campuses, then you would not select direct certification because you're using other methods. This is only if you're just using the direct certification data. And again, that's a subset of all students that would be eligible. And usually a direct certification percentage is a lot lower than when you include other measures to determine that low-income eligibility. So if the campus meets Title I eligibility based on this option, then for basis of eligibility, you would select direct certification. All right, so this concludes the overview of the basis of eligibility options. There's a lot more to cover, but I know we've been here for a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and take a short break, about a 7-minute break, and we will resume the training at 10 a.m. Okay, welcome back from the break. So we've gone over the total campus enrollment column, the campus low income percentage column, the basis of eligibility column, and now we're going to be looking at the additional Title I eligibility column. So this column requires only one selection if the column is enabled. The column will only be enabled if the campus low income percentage entered for the campus is less than 35%. And the campus has a status of school-wide or targeted assistance. So now you can see why it's important to follow the order that we've recommended, because it's going to take what's the data that's in the campus low income percentage and the campus status to determine whether you need data entered in the additional Title I eligibility column. So for each campus where the column is enabled, you're going to select one of the options to reflect the additional eligibility method that the campus is using to establish overall Title I eligibility. Now, as previously mentioned, the column will only be enabled if the campus low-income percentage entered for the campus is less than 35% and the campus has a status of school-wide or targeted assistance. Now, the only time that none is acceptable as a selection is when the LEA is exempt from the rank and serve requirements because the LEA has less than 1,000 students or only operates one campus, or when the campus low income percentage is greater than or equal to the LEA's low income percentage. For specific information and definitions for each of the options, please see the SC5000 schedule instructions and the SC5000 guidance handbook. So after an LEA has served, so now we're going to kind of take a look at those options that are available under the additional Title I eligibility column. And the first option is the 1-year transition. We also have grade span grouping, EdFlex individual programmatic waiver, and of course, none. So let's take a look at the 1-year transition option. The 1-year transition option allows a campus that was Title I served in the previous year, but is no longer Title I eligible, to be eligible for a Title I campus allocation. This option may only be used in the year directly following Title I eligibility. The provision applies to a newly ineligible school and not to an eligible school that has fallen in the poverty ranking compared to the previous year's ranking and does not receive a Title I allocation because its LEA, or from its LEA, because the LEA allocates its Title I funds to other eligible schools with the higher poverty percentages. If a campus meets Title I eligibility based on the option referenced here and is to be a Title I served campus, the basis of eligibility noted on the SC5000 would be either residing or enrollment based on the data the LEA used to calculate the low income percentage. And additionally, in the additional Title I eligibility column, 1-year transition would be selected. So we're going to look at an example of this. So on this SC5000 for the 24-25 school year, Edgar ISD reported that their low income percentage is 30.54%. For Edgar Intermediate, they reported a low-income percentage of 34.24%. Although the campus low-income percentage is less than 35%, they are still eligible to receive a Title I campus allocation because the campus low-income percentage is greater than or equal to the LEA's low-income percentage of 30.54%. If you notice that none was selected in the additional Title I eligibility column because the campus meets eligibility requirements due to the LEA's low-income percentage. So we can establish that in 24-25, Edgar Intermediate was Title I eligible. So now let's fast forward to 25-26. On this SC5000 for the 25-26 school year, Edgar ISD reported that their low-income percentage is now 39.54%. For Edgar Intermediate, they reported a low-income percentage of 33.24%. So since the campus low-income percentage is not equal to or less than 35% and not equal to or less than the LEA's low-income percentage, the campus is not Title I eligible based on their low-income percentage. However, since the campus was eligible to operate a Title I program in 24-25, they can use the one-year transition to establish eligibility in the following year, which in this case is 25-26. On the SC5000, the LEA would select one-year transition under the additional Title I eligibility column. Now keep in mind that they can only use this option for 25-26 because it is a one-year transition. If their low-income percentage remains not equal to or less than 35% and not equal to or less than the LEA's low-income percentage in 26-27, they will not be Title I eligible unless they meet eligibility using a different option. For example, feeder pattern or grade span grouping. But again, this is an example of the one-year transition option. Now let's look at the grade span grouping option. So in addition to the district-wide ranking method we looked at earlier, an LEA may determine eligibility within grade spans and choose which grade spans to serve. In doing so, the LEA may use its district-wide percentage of poverty or the percentage of poverty data of the relevant grade spans. And we're going to take a look at an example of this. If a grade span poverty percentage is 35% or greater, the LEA may also identify as eligible any school with a poverty percentage of at least 35%. When using the grade span grouping option, if there is only one school in a grade span, that school is eligible for Title I funds, regardless of its poverty percentage. Now, provided that any school above 75% poverty has received a Title I allocation. So now let's take a look at a couple of examples where an LEA uses the grade span grouping option. This example shows School Q as the only school in a grade span, which is a high school. School Q is eligible for Title I funds because it is the only school in the high school grade span. Please note that if the LEA chooses to determine Title I eligibility using the grade span grouping option and there is only one school in a grade span, that school is eligible for Title I funds, provided that any school above 75% poverty has received a Title I allocation, which in this case is Public School A. In this example, the LEA grouped all the elementary schools together in one grade span. The poverty percentage for the elementary school grade span is 32.8%. In this example, schools G, C, D, B, F, I, E, and H are eligible because their poverty percentage is at least as high as the grade span's poverty percentage of 32.8%. The other schools are ineligible because their poverty percentage is lower than the grade span poverty percentage. So again, in this case, when you're using the grade span option, you do not use the LEA poverty percentage. You can use the grade span poverty percentage to determine eligibility within that particular grade span. In this example, the LEA grouped all the middle schools together in one grade span. The poverty percentage of the middle school grade span in this example is 33.9%. So considering that middle school poverty percent, School O is eligible because its poverty percentage exceeds the grade span's poverty percentage of 33.9%. In contrast, schools N and P are ineligible because the poverty percentage of each school is lower than the grade span poverty percentage of 33.9%. So on the SC5000, if a campus meets Title I eligibility based on the option reference here, which is a grade span grouping option, and is to be a Title I served campus, the basis of eligibility noted on the SC5000 would either be residing or enrollment based on the data that was used to calculate the low income percentage, and then the LEA would select grade span grouping under the additional Title I eligibility column. The LEA would report the low income percentage for the campus. The LEA would maintain locally for documentation purposes the list of grouped campuses, low income numbers, and enrollment from those campuses that comprise the grade span grouping for the campus in question. So again, this is different than feeder pattern. For feeder pattern, you include the low income percentage of the feeder pattern. For grade span grouping, you continue to include the low income percentage for the campus, not for the grade span. Now, the next option we will look at is the EdFlex individual programmatic waiver option. This option can be used to establish Title I eligibility for a campus that does not meet the low income criteria to be a Title I campus at all. So this is, if you will, the last resort. Please note that utilizing this option involves multiple steps. There is additional action required by the LEA for selecting this option. The LEA would need to apply for and receive an EdFlex individual programmatic waiver in order to qualify as a Title I campus. Now, this process is different than what is involved for the school-wide EdFlex waiver. This process involves review by the state's EdFlex committee and approval by the Commissioner of Education. Now, TEA may only consider an LEA's request to waive the Title I campus eligibility requirements if the low income percentage for the campus in question is within 10 percentage points of the lowest served campus that does meet the statutory eligibility requirements. The waiver application process needs to be started early, as you're going to see that there are several steps before the waiver application can be considered for approval. The process includes completing the waiver application, soliciting public comment, determining evaluation criteria based on the evaluation requirements, site-based decision-making committee review and approval, campus principal review and approval, superintendent review and approval, Board of Trustees review and approval, submission to TEA, review by the EdFlex committee, and ultimately review and approval by the Commissioner of Education. So again, this process takes a while, and the LEA cannot utilize this option for Title I eligibility until the LEA has received formal approval from the Commissioner of Education. So it's important that if you've identified campuses that do not meet any of the Title I eligibility requirements and you would like to serve that campus using the EdFlex individual programmatic waiver option, and the campus is within 10 percentage points of the last served campus, then you might already want to start planning for this process. So again, on the SC5000, the acceptable selections under basis of eligibility are residing enrollment, And again, once you have been approved to receive an EdFlex individual programmatic waiver on the SC5000, you would select under additional Title I eligibility, EdFlex individual programmatic waiver. So let's look at an example. On this SC5000, MOE ISD is trying to establish Title I eligibility for MOE High School. MOE High School has a low income percentage of 34.24%. Now, MOE ISD reported that the LEA low income percentage is 46.23. Since MOE High School's low income percentage is not equal to or greater than 35% and not equal to or greater than the LEA's low income percentage, the campus is not Title I eligible using the LEA poverty percent or 35% options. So the LEA is now going to try using the EdFlex individual programmatic waiver option to establish Title I eligibility for MOE High School. The LEA has gone through the process previously referenced, and at the time the LEA is notified the waiver was approved by the TEA Commissioner of Education, the LEA can now select individual programmatic waiver under the Title I eligibility column. So if you've submitted the waiver and you have to submit your SC5000, you would have to have this campus as not noted as not served if they do not meet eligibility requirements. And once that approval is secured and you've received the official notification letter, then you can amend your SC5000 and then allocate Title I funds to the campus in question. And now the last option under the additional Title I eligibility column is none. I kind of went over that briefly, but the only time that none is acceptable as a selection is when any of the following apply. The LEA is exempt from rank and serve requirements because the LEA has less than 1,000 students. The LEA is exempt from the rank and serve requirements because the LEA only operates one campus, or the campus low income percentage is greater than or equal to the LEA's low income percentage. So after an LEA has ranked all its schools by percentage of poverty, identified schools with a poverty percent above 75%, and determined if high schools above 50% poverty will be served if funds remained, the LEA had those several options for serving the remaining campuses. And this concludes the process for ranking and identifying eligible campuses. So remember earlier I stated the first step in this process is to determine eligibility, right? So once you've gone through all the processes that I just went over, now it's time to go over the eligibility requirements to select the campus-based program that will be implemented on those eligible campuses. So again, a lot of times we rush to saying, oh, well, this campus is going to be school-wide, this one's going to be targeted assistance, without actually seeing if they're eligible in the first place. So it's important as we're going through those columns, where you fill out the campus enrollment, campus low income percentage, basis of eligibility, then additional Title I eligibility. That kind of guides you in those steps to then move into selecting the campus-based program that will be operated by campuses that have already been determined to meet Title I eligibility. So Title I, Part A, is unique in that most of the funds that an LEA receives are required to be allocated to campuses. And campuses have, Title I eligible campuses have the option to implement either a school-wide program or a targeted assistance program. However, there are certain criteria for implementing a school-wide program. Now, the purpose of a school-wide program is to upgrade the entire education program to improve the achievement of the lowest achieving students. There's a lot more flexibility when you're implementing a school-wide program rather than a targeted assistance program. Now, in order to operate a school-wide program, the campus must have a low income percentage of at least 40%. There is also a one-year planning process that is required that includes completing a comprehensive needs assessment, creating or developing a school-wide program plan based on the comprehensive needs assessment, and then ensuring that all parent and family engagement requirements are in place for implementing the Title I campus-based program. Now, for targeted assistance campus, services are only provided to eligible children that have been identified as having the greatest need for special assistance. And usually a targeted assistance campus is a campus that is either ineligible for a school-wide program, which is that 40% threshold, or they have chosen not to operate a school-wide program, which is also acceptable. Now, usually a campus implementing a targeted assistance program would have a low-income percentage of at least 35% or equal to or greater than the LEA low-income percentage, because again, a targeted assistance campus also has to meet the overall Title I eligibility requirements. Now, as I mentioned, there's the 40% requirement for school-wide program eligibility. However, in statute, there is additional flexibility for campuses that may not have a low-income percentage of 40%. And so there are some options for operating a school-wide program for a campus that has a low-income percent of less than 40%. And these are the options. They can exercise the school-wide previous year option. So if a campus does not meet Title I eligibility, but they do meet the 40, or they previously met the 40% threshold, and they've been eligible to operate a school-wide program in the past, then they could use the school-wide previous year option. But again, they have to be eligible. Now, if a Title I eligible campus has never operated a school-wide program in the past, the next option an LEA may use is the feeder pattern option. So again, the same concept applies of feeder pattern that we discussed earlier for overall Title I eligibility, but now you can apply the feeder pattern option for school-wide program eligibility. This option can be used to establish a campus's school-wide program eligibility by projection based on the number of low-income students in the campus attendance areas that feed into that campus. So if the feeder pattern low-income percentage is at least 40%, then the campus can operate a school-wide program based on the feeder pattern option. Now, if neither the school-wide previous year option nor the feeder pattern option works for a campus to establish school-wide program eligibility, the LEA can apply for an EdFlex school-wide eligibility waiver for the campus. And of course, it's important that newly served campuses must have completed the one-year school-wide transition planning process that I went over previously. So we're now going to take a look at some examples for each of the options that I just described. We're going to take a look at school-wide previous year, EdFlex school-wide eligibility waiver in more detail when we get to the additional school-wide eligibility column in the SC5000 that references those particular items. But for now, let's look at feeder pattern. So again, if a campus meets Title I eligibility based on the option referenced here and is to be a Title I served campus, the LEA would note feeder pattern. The LEA would report the projected low-income percentage for the campus based on the feeder pattern, and the LEA would maintain locally, for documentation purposes, the list of feeder campuses, low-income numbers, and the respective enrollment for those campuses that comprise the feeder pattern for the campus in question. Again, if the campus is eligible for Title I, however, say their low-income percentage falls between 35 and 39, and you initially said that they were just eligible based on enrollment because it's greater than 35%. And then later you determine that you want this campus to also be a school-wide program campus, then at that point you can decide whether feeder pattern is an option. And if the feeder pattern has a low-income percent of 40%, then at that point you can change the basis of eligibility to feeder pattern, because although they meet Title I eligibility, you're now using the feeder pattern option to establish school-wide program eligibility. So let's take a look at an example for feeder pattern. On this SC5000, ESSA ISD is trying to establish school-wide program eligibility for ESSA Middle School. ESSA Middle School has a low income percentage of 36%. Since ESSA Middle School's low income percent is greater than 35%, the campus is Title I eligible. So the LEA is now going to try to use the feeder pattern option to establish school-wide program eligibility for ESSA Middle School by projection. So as you can see here, ESSA Elementary is the only, in this example, ESSA Elementary is the only campus that feeds into ESSA Middle School, and the campus meets school-wide program eligibility because the campus has a low income percentage of 45%. So because the feeder pattern campus's low income percentage is 45, they can use that to establish school-wide program eligibility for ESSA Middle School. If the LEA chooses to use feeder pattern to establish that school-wide program eligibility for ESSA Middle School, they would need to include the campus low income percentage for the feeder pattern that makes the campus school-wide program eligible, and they would need to select feeder pattern as a basis of eligibility for the campus in question. So again, they're using the feeder pattern percentage. Now, this is an easy example. A more complex example would include multiple schools that feed into another secondary campus. And so the calculation that will need to be looked at is the low income percentage of the entire feeder pattern. So now that we have gone over, we started with total campus enrollment, then we moved to campus low income percentage, then we talked about basis of eligibility, then we moved on to additional Title I eligibility. Now we are now moving into the campus status selection. And again, we're going in the recommended order. So we haven't gotten to the additional school-wide eligibility. And I know we just covered school-wide eligibility, but we have to select the campus status before the additional school-wide eligibility column is either enabled or disabled based on what's included in the campus status column. So the campus status drop-down list option includes school-wide program, targeted assistance program, not served, or skipped. For specific information and definitions for each of the options, please see the SC5000 schedule instructions and the SC5000 guidance handbook. So it's important to note that as we're looking at, so we already went over what school-wide program was, what targeted assistance was. So the next option is skip. So keep in mind that the skip option is for LEAs that would like to use an exception for not serving a particular campus in rank order. Now, for LEAs with a total enrollment of 1,000 more students, a campus is identified as a skip campus in the following situations. A campus has a low income percentage over 75% is not served, while other campuses with a lower low income percent are served. Another campus with the same grade span and a lower income percentage is served. Now, LEAs with a total of less than 1,000 students do not have skipped campuses. All campuses should be designated as either a served or a not served campus. Now, skipping is an exception to the requirements that are described when trying to allocate Title I funds to campuses in rank order of poverty. So it allows an LEA to elect not to serve, which is the reason we're calling it skipped, an eligible school that has a higher percentage of students from low-income families, only if the school meets the Title I comparability requirements, the school receives supplemental funds from state or local sources that it spends according to requirements to operate a Title I school-wide or targeted assistance program, on the programs that meet the intent and purpose of Title I, and the supplemental funds the school spends from other sources equal or exceed the amount it would have received under Title I. So again, under those circumstances are the only, that's the only time that a campus can be skipped. And when we mean skipped is that they're either they're not provided an allocation in rank order. Instead, they're skipped in the rank order, and a campus below it is provided a Title I allocation. Now, if an LEA skips a school, the LEA is still required to use Title I funds to provide equitable services to equitable private school equitable students who reside in the attendance area of the skipped school. An LEA must determine which school attendance areas would have received Title I funds absent any skipping and or not serving and the per pupil allocations. The LEA must then determine the amount of funds that would have been allocated for PMP school students residing in eligible school attendance areas. Now, the other option under campus status is not served, right? This is a final option for a campus status, and the designation is for any campus that the LEA has elected not to serve as a Title I campus and that does not meet the criteria for a skipped campus. And then just a quick note is that closed campuses may still display on the SC5000 several years after their removal is requested from ASTED. So the LEA should designate any closed campus as not served. So now we're moving on to the additional school-wide eligibility. So it's important that the campus status column was completed because that school-wide designation is now going to now this column for additional school-wide eligibility is going to take the campus low income percentage and the campus status into account when it's determining whether this column will be enabled or disabled for the campus. So the column will only be enabled if the campus status selected is school-wide and the campus low-income percentage entered for the campus is less than 40%, right? The threshold is 40%. So if the low income is less than 30%, then there should be some other way that you are designating that campus as school-wide eligible because they do not meet the threshold of 40%. So for each campus where the column is enabled, you would select one of the options to reflect the additional school-wide eligibility method that the campus is using to establish that school-wide program eligibility. So the two options under that column are school-wide EdFlex waiver and school-wide previous year. And as previously shared, the column will only be enabled if the campus status selected is school-wide and the campus low-income percentage entered for the campus is less than 40%. So let's take an example. Let's look at an example of the school-wide previous year option. As per the screenshot of the SC5000 for ESSA ISD for the 23-24 school year, ESSA Elementary was eligible to operate a school-wide program eligibility or a school-wide program since they met overall Title I eligibility and school-wide program eligibility with a low income percent that was at least 40%. So again, 23-24. Now we're going to fast forward to 25-26. So in 25-26, ESSA Elementary's low income percent dropped to 36.23%. Since their low income percentage is greater than 35%, they are Title I eligible, and since they were eligible to operate a school-wide program in a previous year, right? Because we looked at the 23-24, they were eligible to operate that program in 23-24, they can continue to operate a school-wide program for as long as they maintain overall Title I eligibility. The LEA would select school-wide previous year to indicate that the campus is using the school-wide previous year option to establish that program, school-wide program eligibility. Now, this campus also used the school-wide previous year option in 24-25 as well to establish school-wide eligibility. However, in this example, we provided an example of the option being used 2 years later to demonstrate that for as long as the campus remains Title I eligible overall, they can continue to use the school-wide previous year option to establish school-wide program eligibility. So in other words, if ESSA Elementary had dropped to 20%, then they wouldn't be eligible for Title I to operate a program. Therefore, they could not use a school-wide previous year option because they're not eligible to operate a program at all. And again, taking into account the LEA's low income percentage of 32.54%. Now let's take a look at an option or an example for option 3, which is the EdFlex school-wide eligibility waiver. On this SC5000, MOE-ISD is trying to establish school-wide program eligibility for MOE Elementary, which has a low income percentage of 36.24%. Since MOE Elementary's low income percent is greater than or equal to the LEA's low income percent of 32.25, the campus is Title I eligible. However, since they do not meet the 40% school-wide program eligibility threshold, they are not eligible to operate a school-wide program. If they are not eligible for school-wide previous year and are not able to establish school-wide program eligibility using the feeder pattern option, the only other option is to apply for an EdFlex school-wide eligibility waiver. Now, this waiver is different, as I mentioned previously, than the EdFlex individual programmatic waiver that is used to establish overall Title I eligibility. To apply for and receive the EdFlex school-wide waiver, the LEA would select the school-wide EdFlex waiver option under the additional school-wide eligibility column. And once the application is reviewed and approved, the waiver is automatically approved. There's no process of submitting an application, getting it through all the approval processes like you would do in submitting the EdFlex individual programmatic waiver. Now, there is a caveat for this. There is documentation that is required to be maintained locally for this waiver. When they apply for the waiver, they're assuring that they have gone through the process outlined in the required supporting documentation form. The form should be maintained locally and is available and be made available upon request from TEA and or an auditor. If you hover over this screenshot, you'll see the web page where you can access the supporting documentation form, but again, you must maintain that documentation form if you're applying for a school-wide eligibility waiver. Okay, we're almost close to the end of the SC5000. So again, we started with total campus enrollment. We moved on to campus low income percentage. We moved on to basis of eligibility, then additional Title I eligibility, then campus status, and we just recently went over additional school-wide eligibility. And now we are on the number of students served on a TA campus column. So this column is to be completed only for campuses that the LEA chooses to serve as a targeted assistance campus. If the campus is implementing a targeted assistance program as noted under the campus status column, you would enter the number of students who meet the multiple educationally related objective criteria that the LEA and campus have established to determine which students at the campus are most in need of services under Title I Part A. Again, this column will only be enabled if the campus had a status of targeted assistance. The next column we'll be looking at is a consolidated funds column, and it is a drop-down list. This you would complete this column only if the campus's Title I Part A campus status is school-wide program. So the ESSA statute only allows funds to be consolidated in a school-wide program campus. So again, the consolidated funds designation is for each campus because it doesn't mean that you can consolidate funds district-wide. This is for consolidating funds on a school-wide campus. And of course, up there we have not the same as consolidating administrative funds. This is consolidating funds on a school-wide campus. So you would select from the drop-down list to indicate whether and how the LEA intends to consolidate funds in the school-wide campus budget. The drop-down list options include Title I Part A only, federal funds only, or federal, state, and local. For specific information and definitions for each of the options, please see the SC5000 schedule instructions and the SC5000 guidance handbook. And please note again that this is not related to whether the LEA consolidates administrative funds. These are funds that are being consolidated on a school-wide campus to offer more flexibility for that campus principal in utilizing all their funds on the campus. So again, This is a whole training in itself related to consolidating funds on a school-wide campus. So please take a look at the additional information located in the documents I reference or in the SC5000 guidance handbook for additional information about what is consolidation of funds on a school-wide campus and to look at the different options. And the last column that we're going to be looking at is the other column. This allows you to type text, and it's for the LEA to explain any other special circumstances that may apply to a campus if applicable. For example, if you selected school-wide program previous year in the additional eligibility column, you must list the year and the percentage the campus established school-wide eligibility in the other column. So again, that is the only example where the other column would be used, and that is when you've selected school-wide previous year under the additional school-wide eligibility column, and that is so you can document and let us know in which year was the campus initially eligible to operate a school-wide program. So that concludes Section B of the SC5000. And now we're going to be moving on to Section C, campus assurances. So we have added 2 additional assurances to this section that will be described in further detail in the subsequent slides. Please note that the check boxes will be enabled or disabled based on certain conditions. By selecting the assurance checkbox, the LEA is assuring that they have complied with the federal requirements for the different designations for each campus being served or skipped. So we will start off with the SW Campuses Assurance, which stands for school-wide. So the checkbox will be enabled if school-wide is selected under the campus status column for at least one campus. And by selecting the assurance, the LEA is assuring that the campus planned for up to a year to be school-wide and the elements of a school-wide program are included in their school-wide and/or campus improvement plan. The next assurance is the Targeted Assistance Campus Assurance. This checkbox will only be enabled if TA is selected under the campus status column for at least one campus. And by selecting the TA for one or more campuses, the LEA is assuring that each of the following, that the LEA includes in the district improvement plan their multiple educationally related objective criteria to identify students in greatest need, and the campus may have supplemental criteria in the campus improvement plan. And then the LEA can only serve students identified as being in greatest need and not all students in a grade. The skip assurances checkbox will be enabled if skip is selected under the campus status column for at least one campus. And again, we went through these requirements, but by selecting skip for one or more campuses, the LEA is assuring all of the following: that each skip campus meets the comparability of services requirement, that each skip campuses receive supplemental funds from other state or local sources that are expended according to the requirements of a targeted assistance or a school-wide campus program, and the funds expended from such other sources equal or exceeded the amount that would have been provided to the campus under Title 1A. The school-wide EdFlex waiver assurance checkbox will be enabled if school-wide EdFlex waiver is selected under the additional school-wide eligibility column for at least one campus. And by selecting this checkbox, the LEA is assuring that a supporting documentation form is readily available upon request from TEA and/or an auditor for the campuses which the LEA is applying for a school-wide eligibility EdFlex waiver. And then the last checkbox, you're going to hear a little bit more about the 125% special allocation rule when Vivian starts talking about allocating funds to Title I eligible campuses. And this checkbox is going to be enabled if a low income percent of less than 35% is entered under the campus low income percent column and school-wide or targeted assistance is selected under the campus status column for at least one campus. By selecting this checkbox, the LEA is assuring that the documentation showing evidence that the LEA implemented the 125% special allocation rule for all its Title I served campuses is readily available upon request from TEA and/or an auditor. So now we're moving on to Section D, which is the supplement not supplant section. So for supplement not supplant, there are two options for Title I Part A. Again, this is supplement not supplant as it relates to the Title I Part A program. So the LEA would select the statement that applies to the LEA. So either these are the two only options for supplement not supplant for Title I Part A. The LEA has a written Title I neutral methodology for distributing its state and local funds to its campuses. Or the LEA has a valid statement of exemption based on criteria described in the supplement not supplant handbook. So again, this is required. One of the options is required. So you would need to select one or the other options. All right, so that concludes the SC5000 schedule. So again, we went through each of the sections. And so once you've determined which campuses are eligible, you've reported them, it's now time to move into how, the funds and how they're going to be allocated in that rank order to the campuses that you've determined to be eligible to receive those Title I allocations. And so we're now going to take another 10-minute break before we move on to the next section. It is 10:45, so we'll do a 10-minute break. So if we can be back by 10:55, and I'll put the break slide on in just a bit. So we'll come back at 10:55. Thank you.